Welcome to Living in Fiction. I am your host, Arthur Aguirre. I'm a professor in leadership and communication. I'm also a coach and a consultant in leadership and communication. And this is Living in Fiction. If this is your first episode watching, I love what I do, particularly in education. And I firmly believe that learning can and should be fun. And one of the ways that I do that is by bringing media into my classrooms. In almost every class that I teach, I either bring a movie or a TV show or something along those lines to help folks connect some of the things that we're learning with something that they can tangibly see versus trying to apply it in the real world scenarios. For whatever reason, it always seems to help make that connection so that they can then apply what we've learned to their real life. So all that being said, Living in Fiction is an edutainment podcast where we typically look at some of the best movies, some of our favorite movies, and some ridiculous movies to see what we've learned to avoid, and what's inspired us. I'm working on season 2 right now, and so in the meantime, I wanted to do something fun. I love the show The Bear from FX, and with the new season coming June 27th, I thought we'd do a deep dive and rewatch all the episodes, and I can give you a little bit of the leadership and communication takeaways from each of them. So we're going to be doing 3 episodes per episode. So today we're starting off with episodes 1, 2, and 3. So before we get started, we should set the table, no pun intended, and go over the cast from the show. So we have Jeremy Allen White playing Carmen. We have Eben Mas Baccarat playing Richie. We have Ayo Edebiri playing Sydney. We got Lisa Colon Zayas playing Tina. Lionel Boyce playing Marcus. Abby Elliott playing Natalie or Sugar. We got Maddie Matheson playing Fack. We've got Edwin Lee Gibson playing Ibrahim. We got Corey Hendricks playing Gary Sweeps Woods. We have Richard Estreras playing Manny, and Jose M. Cervantes playing Angel. And there's a ton of other ones. We got Oliver Platt also playing Uncle Jimmy. It's a fantastic cast. Like, whoever was in charge of casting for the show did a phenomenal job. Absolutely love everybody. But let's go ahead and get into episode 1. In episode 1, called The System, we have Carmi Brzado showing up for what seems like one of his first days running the restaurant. And he's trying to run this sandwich shop, which was his brother's sandwich shop, like an upscale kitchen, right? We learn a little bit of the backstory of Carmen. We learn that his brother, and this is over the course of the first 3 episodes, but we learn that his brother didn't really want him in the shop. And we'll find out, if you haven't seen the show, you kind of start learning bits and pieces of information about their relationship and the dynamic of the family, and why it kind of makes sense why Michael didn't want Carmi around. The other aspect of this episode is Carmen trying to train Sydney, right? She's staging, which is essentially an unpaid internship. And he's also just trying to get his feet underneath him, like trying to figure out the logistics of running this restaurant. So for this breakdown and for some of these lessons and takeaways, I wanted to come up with a system for myself. So kind of have like the main overarching lesson and then some mini ones underneath. So the biggest lesson here is how to create a culture, right? Because essentially that's what Carmen's trying to do. He is trying to get the culture that he knows and that he has flourished in and bring it to the sandwich shop, which, as you can tell if you watch his first episode, is a little tumultuous. So the first thing, communication, right? Underneath this idea of creating a culture, you do that through communication. I have studied communication basically my entire adult life, and the way that we create meaning is through language and through communication, right? It's how we create a connection with the people around us. One of the ways that I've studied it is through a theory called speech codes theory, which essentially just states regardless of which speech community or just a community that you're a part of, there are both verbal and nonverbal ways of speaking that have these rules that are in place, right? And we see that a little bit in what Carmi is doing, right? So the fact that he calls everybody chef and he tells people it's a sign of respect. We have the housekeeping, right? Making sure that everyone's cleaning their stations. Everyone says behind or corner when the way they're moving around. Even little things. At one point in the episode, Carmen asks Richie, what's your best day of the week? And he says 5, right? Most people would assume you just say Friday. And even me, I'm making the assumption there, right? I'm assuming 5 is Friday. But you see how the power of using that word or those phrases can help create your own kind of speech code, right? Because we get buy-in from Marcus, right? I'm kind of jumping all over the place here, but you get buy-in from Marcus at the very end where he says herd chef to Carmi, after Carmi's kind of been fighting tooth and nail to get people to jump on board. But you see a little bit, it starts off as a mistake, But if you are a fan of the show and have watched this, you see that Tina says Jeff because first she mishears him, right? And then he explains that, I said chef. And later on he explains the importance of that. But then she just starts calling him Jeff. Like, that is now the speech code of this restaurant, right? And if you actually go fast forward and look at episode 1 of season 2, we even have Sweeps calling him Jefferson, right? So now it's kind of building on this thing that this culture that they've created through their communication. The next thing I want to talk about in terms of creating a culture is commitment, right? We see that from Carmen from the very beginning when he realizes that this restaurant is basically underwater, right? He is trying to make ends meet in whatever way he can. We see that in the way that he is selling his jacket, the one that his brother gave him. He's selling jeans, all of these things just to get through the day, right? Just one more day to figure things out. Even doing that ball breaker tournament, all of that is a visual representation of his commitment, right? The people that are working there don't even know about the jeans and the jacket. They see that he's doing the ball breaker thing. But we as a viewer get to witness some of that commitment from Carmen, right? And that's something that you need when you're trying to establish a brand new culture. And lastly, kind of links up with what the first one was in terms of communication, is story. Story is everything, right? We are naturally narrative creatures. If you think about when you were a kid, or if you have kids yourself, they want you to tell them a story before bed, or they really connect with particular movies, particularly Disney movies, right? And it's not that they can see themselves in that character, although sometimes that's part of it, but it's mostly they get wrapped up into these stories, and that can help in building the culture in whatever environment that you're in, right? So Sydney could be anywhere, but part of the reason why she wants to be there is, one, working with Carmen, but two, because she mentions that every Sunday she used to go there with her dad. And story is also the way that we find out about Michael. We learn so much more about Michael and who he is and what people thought about him through the stories that they're telling throughout the show. So his story and the restaurant story are essentially entwined, so it's important that you hear that, right? Often leaders get put into a brand new situation, and part of your job when you get into a new situation like that is hearing the story of that new organization and the people who are a part of it. And just a last quick tip here in terms of communication, there is a scene where Richie follows Carmen and Sydney into the walk-in freezer or fridge, and that's when Carmen tells Richie that he brought on Sydney and all these other things. Sydney walks out, and Richie and Carmen really get into it, and the argument is just about Carmen bringing all these new things and Richie trying to tell him not to do that. But what he ends up doing is what we call kitchen sinking, right? He starts bringing in all of these different past grievances that he's probably held against Carmen for quite some time and dropping it all right there, right? That is not a way of having a productive conversation, right? But we tend to do that. A lot of us avoid conflict, and we think, oh, it'll be okay, but you're really just making this list in the back of your head, and you bring it in these moments where it's like, oh, now I have all this ammunition that I've been waiting to throw on you. And you see that happen, and they just start throwing jabs at each other. So avoid doing that. Don't avoid conflict. Just have a conversation about conflict. All right, on to episode 2. Episode 2 is titled Hands, right? And it centers on two main things. One, Sydney trying to find a way to become Carmen's sous chef. And two, fixing the issues that come up with the health inspector who gave them a C for the problem she found in the shop. So for this episode, my main phrase is learn to listen, right? And so we'll break it up into a few parts here. The first one is listen to create trust. Something as simple as when Sydney is yelling fire about a certain dish and Ibrahim is responding back to her, right? Like, you are building that trust in that environment, especially when things can get really chaotic. Later on, Marcus asks Carmen why they clean things the way that they do, like with the toothbrush and everything. He says it's about consistency and being consistent, right? Marcus is listening and trying to hear what the purpose and the reason is behind what it is that they're doing, right? That is a way of building that trust by providing that why, right? Because Carmen could easily say, I'm running this place, do it because I'm telling you to. But no, he wants to give him the reason why they do that. We can also see the opposite side of it, right? If you are not listening to someone, it is hard to build trust, right? So Tina, even though, she might be skeptical, it's a brand new person, but she is clearly skeptical about Sydney, right? She is not hearing anything she has to say. She's letting her preconceived notions cloud her judgment. And you hear that, right? When the way she talks to Ibrahim, she says, I'm telling you, beware of bitches with little notebooks. The little theory behind this is the halo and the horn effect. This happens all the time, right? There's someone that we like, someone that we love. Oftentimes you'll see this at the very beginning of like a romantic relationship where everything they do, you see with rose-colored glasses, right? You have some way of justifying it or providing an excuse for it. And then we have the opposite end of it, right? We have the horn effect where you just don't like this person. And so anything they do, you'll find a reason to attribute it to them just being a bad person. And at this moment in episode 2, this is kind of where Tina and Sydney are. Where it doesn't matter what Sydney does, what her intentions are, Tina only sees the negative side of it. The next thing, listen to lead. Right, so Carmen doesn't listen to Sydney when she's presenting him with all the work that she's done on how they could be more profitable, pay for one, her being a sous chef, but all the other things that they could be paying for if she listened, and at the very least, if Carmen would look at what she created. We see another moment where Richie, because again, it's an emotional moment when they get that C from the health inspector, Sydney is trying to explain something to the health inspector, and Richie is just like yelling and screaming over her. Right, and you see even Sydney even try to say that, and she couldn't even get a word in edgewise because of how Richie is doing things. And lastly, kind of going back to what I was talking about with episode 1, you want to listen for these stories, right? You learn when you listen. You find out that Michael was dealing with mental health issues, but he was still someone who everyone loved. You find out Richie is clinging to the system and the way things are because it's how Michael had them. But you also find out that he's a dad, and a dad who loves his kid and is doing his absolute best. So you always want to make sure that you are listening and learning to listen. Finally, we have episode 3, Brigade. So on the heels of his first Al-Anon meeting, Carmen is trying to rid the shop of the chaos and tells Sydney they're going to run it brigade style. Sydney pushes back, but Carmen insists. It does not go well, mostly because Carmen leaves shortly after informing the team about the new system. In the end, he ends up hiring Sydney. And he acknowledges the problem and how he handled everything. So, episode 3, the big thing for me is buy-in, right? So we have episode 1, we have creating a culture. Part 2, learn to listen. Episode 3, buy-in, right? And then you can kind of see how they kind of connect with one another. But with buy-in, the first thing I have here is you have to show you're all in to get the buy-in, right? We get this really great moment at the very beginning of the episode with Molly Ringwald. I love some of the things that she said. She's like, we can't curb that kind of chaos until the thinking changes, until the foundations change, until the chemistry changes. You decide that you want to keep my side of the street clean instead of trying to fix everything, right? And Carmen picks up pieces of that, not all of it, and brings it to the shop, right? So he leaves that meeting really full of like fire and passion of how he's going to fix things. He even at one point has a callback where, because they got that C from the health inspector, tells Sydney a C stands for chaos. Sometimes something like this, like an Al-Anon meeting or something, an exchange you have with somebody, a conversation that you have, a presentation that you go to, a movie or a TV show that you watch, inspires you, and that's fantastic, right? We sometimes just need that kind of kick in the butt, and we need something to light a fire under our ass and keep us going, keep us motivated. But if you don't plan and you don't fully commit to that and provide all the support for that, it's not just lighting a fire under your ass, you're lighting your ass on fire, right? Like you have to fully commit to something if you really want it to work out, right? We see that Carmen tells a group that they're going to do this brigade system and then just leaves Sydney floundering, right? And we can see why the whole team isn't on board, because it's this brand new person, right, who they hardly even know, and she's not getting the full support of Carmen. The next one under that is support and guide. When it comes to your direct reports, because essentially Sydney is a direct report to Carmen, right? You have to empower your direct reports, you have to support your direct reports, and you have to be there for your direct reports, right? That could have gone totally differently if he didn't just up and leave. Now, I also understand that nothing happens in a vacuum, right? Carmen is trying to operate a local business while also dealing with past trauma for the first time, and it's a lot, right? You have to, if you know you're going to be dealing with all of these things, it's still incumbent upon you to create and maintain a system of support for the people that are working for you. You got to listen in order to know how to get your team members to buy in, right? You have to listen to your team. Like, they clearly have already been pushing back against changing their system, and now you're changing the entire way they do things, and you're not providing any support to them. You're not providing any support to Sydney. You can see how this is a recipe for chaos. All that being said, a few odds and ends to the end of this episode. There's a line here that Ibra says that cracked me up. He's like, I was in a brigade once, and someone asked what happened. He says, a lot of people died. I just cracked up when I hear that. The end of episode 3 is great because it also is a callback to my takeaway from episode 2, right? Sydney needed to hear that apology from Carmen. At a certain point, he says, I was dealing with some stuff, but it's not an excuse. I know that. And she says, I know, but now I know that you know, right? Sometimes we just need to feel like we are heard and the other person sees us and understands why we're feeling the way that we're feeling. So those are my big lessons and takeaways from season 1, episodes 1 through 3. Join me next week, season 1, episodes 4, 5, and 6.